Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people in the world of arts and entertainment that I've connected with over the years, and today I'm glad to have on the show Jim Henman. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Well, thank you, Tom, for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here with you.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. Now, Jim, I know that you have been in the music business for a long, long time, but somewhere there had to be an inspiration for you to get into music. Now, on your website, it says, somewhere between the rhythmic yodeling of the singing brakeman Jimmie Rodgers and Jim's love of 1950s country songs and 1960s folk and pop songs lies the roots of Jim Henman's musical beginnings. Beyond that, I know that you met a young Myles Goodwyn decades ago, and things pretty much took off from there, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, I had never had a companion or a friend, that played guitar. I think I was 16 when I met Myles, so it was the first time that I had someone to play guitar with. Other than my dad, who taught me, but it wasn't long before, and I was slightly better than him. He wasn't the best guitar player in the world, but he had a nice Gibson.
From what I understand, though, he's a very quick learner. I spoke to your cousin Ritchie a while ago, and he talked about how the two of you would be in another room in the band house listening to Myles learning how to play piano and just wondering how the heck he could do that.
Well, just to correct you, it wasn't Myles that had the Gibson and wasn't as a good guitar player. That was my dad I was talking about.
Oh, okay. All right, well.
Yeah, that was my dad. Myles, we were compatible when we first met. Yeah, we were compatible. Very similar backgrounds in music. And it was just a wonderful thing to meet somebody that had that, that played guitar at the same level as I did and knew the songs that I knew, had the background in country music that I had because in my home, my dad kind of controlled the radio or the stereo at that time. And he loved the old Jimmie Rodgers, the yodeling, the ole, which I learned. That was some of the first songs I learned on guitar was Jimmie Rodgers, the country blues.
That's very interesting. Now, tell me about Woody's Termites.
Oh, that's a long time ago, but I think it was in the mid-'60s when we started that band. It was a high school band, and I was at high school with these guys who approached me, I guess, about playing guitar. And I was playing guitar for the band, and we had another chap playing guitar, a drummer, and a keyboard player, and a lead singer. The guitar player we had at that time had wonderful gear. I had all Fender gear, the Fender Telecaster and the Fender Tremolix. So he had the great gear, but he wasn't that gifted on guitar. So I approached the kind of leader of the band, Dougie Grace, and I said, Dougie, I have a friend who's not in high school yet, but I think he would fit the spot quite a bit better than the guy we've got right now. So that led to Myles coming in the band as a guitar player. My dad bought me a bass, actually to play bass on, with the band. So we had a full lineup there of keyboards, bass, guitar, drummer, and vocalist. That's how it got started. Actually, I think it was for, Tom, if I remember, it was for a high school concert, not a concert of us playing, but one of those presentations where there was a lot of different types of things. There was dance, there was singing, there was the band, there was monologues, or maybe a play, a variety show of sorts, I guess you would call it back then. And we were just part of it. I think we had played maybe, if I recall it, I think it was Love Potion number 9. Yeah.
Classic, yeah. That's interesting.
Classic.
I'm a little bit younger than you are, but back in the early 70s at my high school, we had something called a hootenanny, and it was like that. Yeah. It was like just get up and do whatever you could do. One of my first live performances would have been in grade 9. I had done something in grade 8 earlier, but yeah, it's interesting that back in the day that they used to do those things, and I don't know if that still goes on in school today or not, but we had a kind of a golden age for music all around in the arts. So eventually, from what I understand, the Henman cousins would visit the grandparents' house at separate times, and Myles lived next door to your grandparents?
He did. They lived up on the top of a hill, and he lived on top of a hill, but there was no house in between. There was just some woods in between them. And that was the place where, when I was 16, my parents and my brothers and sisters, we moved to that little house. I'm not sure what the reason was, but we moved there and our grandparents lived elsewhere. And the first day I got there, Myles came running over. Now, I didn't know at that time, it was a while before I realized that he knew my cousins, Dave and Rich, too. But they lived, 45 minutes away, an hour away. So there was no ever any time that they actually played together. I at that point, had not played with Dave and Rich. I didn't even know at that point that they played guitars and drums, as in Rich's case.
Well, it's interesting. Again, I think it was a golden age, and everybody, I talk about when the Beatles hit the Ed Sullivan Show, and that's where a lot of us got our inspiration from. But I know that your cousins were really lit up by Buddy Holly. So there was a venerable cornucopia of music. And I remember back in the day when you didn't really classify things, you'd listen to, at one point you'd hear Gordon Lightfoot, and then it would be Led Zeppelin, and then Anne Murray, followed by whatever on the radio. So times were interesting back then, that's for sure. So 1969, and you, along with David and Ritchie, called Myles up, and then April Wine happens. So what was that like for you?
Well, I'll give you a little background on that. Dave and I and Rich had played together in a band here in Halifax called Prism. Not the Prism that was from Upper Canada somewhere, but a local band here in the Maritimes called Prism.
Editor's note, while Jim, Ritchie, and David Henman were playing with their local band that they called Prism in Halifax, at roughly the same time, the band that became famous as Prism and had international success with hits like Take Me to the Captain and Armageddon and so on, was busy toiling away as the Seeds of Time in Montreal, where eventually April Wine would make their claim to fame. Now back to the show.
And I guess they had it going for about a year and a half or so, and then I joined them for about a year, and then we all decided to go back to university. We had finished school and we were decided to go to university. We didn't see any future actually at that point in continuing trying to do anything musically. So we went to St. Mary's University here in Halifax, and my second year, I think I enjoyed the social life too much and didn't attend my classes and didn't study, and decided I'm not prepared to do this at this time, and I decided that I was going to quit. And I talked to Dave and Rich, and I said, listen, let's try to put something together and get out of Nova Scotia, get a little more professionally minded. And David said to me, well, if you can talk your buddy Myles Goodwyn into joining us, yeah, I'd be interested.
And we'll be right back after this.
And Ritchie was the same way. He wasn't totally sold on the idea. He actually stayed at university for another 3 or 4 months just till we kind of were looking like we were serious about what we were doing. And I went down to visit Myles. He was living, I believe, in Antigonish or Cape Breton. I'm not quite sure where he was living at that time. I was 69. And I spent about 3 or 4 days there talking to him about the idea and everything. And, we decided that it would be all writing original materials. That was the prime thing that I wanted to do at that time, was write original material. And Myles was the same way, because we realized we weren't going to get anywhere at all unless we could write half-decent commercial songs, something that would get radio play. And up to that point, we hadn't done that. We had offers back in Woody's Termites to do some recording locally, but it never came to anything, more than talk. And that was probably with the local radio stations here in Halifax. But this time, we were serious, and we wanted to pursue this as a profession. Well, Myles said, I'm going to think about this, because he was playing with Eastgate Sanctuary, and I don't think they weren't that busy. And about a week later, he showed up on the train from down that way with his melody maker and a garbage bag full of his belongings, and said, yeah, let's do it. So that started us on our rehearsals.
And the rest of that was history. That's quite the story, man, I tell you. And I'm fascinated by the fact that the two sets of cousins shared the same grandparents' house at different times, and there was Myles kind of in the background through all of it. That said, when I talked to Ritchie and David, they had different reasons for leaving April Wine, and I guess they were there for 3 albums. You quit shortly after the release of the first album, and I find this very interesting. You left the band to start a family, and that's typical, but to go into a career in medical technology. So you said earlier that you kind of lost interest in school, but all of a sudden now you're inspired to get into a totally different career. So what was that all about?
Well, this is going to sound weird, but, I'm the oldest of 10 kids, 10 children. My dad and mom had 10 children, and they're all still alive, and we're all friends, and we've never lost our friendships. But one of the things that my dad pushed, because he had left school at grade 8, he was self-educated. He did very well at his profession, but he was self-educated. And he was a mathematician and all these wonderful things that he was self-taught. And he pushed this education thing upon us to the point where when I left the band in late 71, I think it was, I didn't know what to do because I had no education. I didn't have any trade. I had nothing. I tried a few different things, and I couldn't see myself working at the post office all my life, which I had a good job there, but I just didn't see me doing that the rest of my life. And I'm not the type of guy that is interested in doing physical labor because I'm not built like that. So this is weird, but this is what happened. I was really spending a lot of time thinking about what I was going to do. I had been away from the band for about a year, I guess, and still writing songs because that's just what I do, even to this day, still writing songs. But I was with one of my brothers, and his wife worked in this line of work, medical technology, in clinical chemistry. And he told me about the job, what they did and that. And I said, gee, that's interesting, because I always kind of liked science. I never saw it as a career, up to that point. He said, there's a guy down there driving a Corvette. One of the guys that works with my wife drives a Corvette. And I thought to myself, geez, that must be a half-decent paying job, I wonder what it's like. So I did a little bit of research, not very much, just a little bit, and said, okay, I'm going to apply for the program. I had to study for 24 months. It took me a straight 24 months, which would be the equivalent of about 3 years at university. I already had a year of university. This would have been equivalent of about 3 years at university. So I called the institute where it was taught, and I found out that they said, well, it's full. I said, what? Yeah, it's full. I said, well, geez, I'm really caught here. I don't have any work right now, and I bleeding heart a little bit, right? And they said, well, we'll see what we can do. So they called me back very shortly and said, yeah, we can fit you in. We can fit you in. Now, somebody made that decision for maybe out of compassion,
Yeah.
So I went back to school for 2 years. And my dad, even though he was a hard dad, when it came to education, if he saw you going the way he believed in, he let me stay at the house. No rent. He just, as long as you're at school, you can stay here. So that's the way it went down. Now, mind you, even when we started April Wine, and, when they knew about our plans to leave and all that, Mom and Dad were behind me, and my dad's brother, Charles, who was Dave and Rich's father, he was behind Dave and Rich doing this. They were solid behind us, and they helped us financially to have the gear and the van and all that stuff to get to Montreal. So we were lucky in that way, very lucky.
Yeah, getting that level of support from your parents in the world of rock and roll as you're starting out isn't all that common.
That's how I ended up in medical technology, and it was a good job. I ended up actually in toxicology, which was very interesting work to do with a lot of therapeutic drugs and overdoses, and my gosh, it was the days when automation and computerization were coming in strong. Just starting to come in really strong. Up to that point, a lot of chemistry was manual stuff and some automation, but when I went to toxicology, it was fascinating, interesting stuff. So I ended my career there. But I continued writing, always continued writing, continued playing. Whenever I felt like, that I had a group of guys that were fun to be with and we could perform, I kind of mixed that up when I wanted to.
Right. Well, I often say that music is the doctor. So you had a hand in both parts of that, really, being
Yeah.
into the medical tech and ongoing music as well. Now, from what I understand, although you never quit playing music, you really kind of dove back in head first back in the 90s as a co-writer and producer.
I did. I wouldn't call myself a producer because I don't have that's not a gift that I have. I'm not a details guy as much as I would like to be for producing, but I've done some projects. But yeah, I got back, I think it was 1990 when I knew that in the next 10 years I was going to be retiring. I took the composition up another level by co-writing with a friend of mine who wrote some books, and he was more of a poet. Not really a poet, but he was that type of thing, prose or something. We started writing together, and we were working with Anne Murray's guitar player, George Hebert, who lived down here, but he was still on the road with Anne at that time, but he was a friend of mine, and we would go into his studio and record the tunes in there as demos, and then when they were ready to be more professionally done, we would bring in some musicians, whatever we needed, violin players, saxophonists, whatever. And we did an album. The first real pro thing I did that was, I guess I would call it pro, yeah, it was a step into the jazz side of things, was with Jeannie Becks from Ma Bouquet Brit. And she did an amazing vocal job in these tunes. She knew how to interpret my melodies and my feel. And we have some good tunes on that project. That's from 1990. And then I did a solo acoustic thing. I recorded it just live. It was just, I always like recording live because I like the energy that comes when you're with an audience. There's a nice energy. Yeah. And then in, I guess it was late 90s, I was visiting Chester, Nova Scotia here. Beautiful little town, seaside town, really beautiful. And a lady came by who I kind of knew a little. And she says, my husband and I and a friend are working on a musical for the Playhouse, which was the community theater place down there. And I said, well, what's the theme and all that? And she said, well, it's going to be called Death the Musical. And I thought, geez, that's weird. But I spent a year with her, Dawn Harvard-Jones, and a good friend of theirs, and we did a play called Death the Musical, which really did very, very well down in Chester.
And we'll be right back after this.
I think we had a 3-week run there, and Brooks Diamond, who was a friend of mine, happened to come down and see it. And he said, geez, he was manager for some very successful people. He had Bruce Guthrie, who was down here under his wing, and Flying on Your Own. Rita McNeil, that's.
Oh, cool. And I understand that you once again partnered with the Neptune Theater.
Yeah, that's what Brooks did. Brooks managed Rita, who had a very successful career, huge career worldwide. And anyways, Brooks saw the play, the musical, and he saw potential there. And so he booked us at the Halifax Neptune Theater, which is quality stuff. They bring in really quality people, quality plays, and they're very successful. And we got a 3-week run there. He chose, the times that he chose was Halloween because of the nature of the play. And we had a good run there, very successful. And the next run was to be Minnesota in the States. And lo and behold, we had that 9/11 event, which closed the door on anything with the name Death the Musical.
Yeah.
So that kind of ended that play, unfortunately. I think it did do a French run in Quebec years ago, and I don't think it's done anything since. It's the type of thing that kind of died in the water. It went as far as it was going to go for that time.
Now, wasn't the Neptune Theater where April Wine had some early beginnings?
Yes, we were asked by, I think it was David Renford, who was there at that time, if we would do some music for Lion in Winter, a play they were doing, a modernization of Lion in Winter. That's Lion, Lion in Winter. And we were asked to compose music that would be kind of artsy, but, would fit the play. And we did. I don't remember any of it, to be honest. We composed it, we recorded it, and they used the recordings as the musical background for the play.
Well, that's quite the interesting start for a band. I often say that there are certain geographical hotspots for music in Canada, and man, the East Coast is certainly one of them. Like you just rhyming off names like Anne Murray and Rita McNeil and so on. And I've been pretty much all over Canada, except I have not been further east than Quebec. And I've got to get out to the East Coast because I know there's just such an awesome musical community out there. I actually have a couple of good friends who sold their house in London, Ontario, and bought a place out in Flat Rock, Newfoundland. So I'll have to make an excuse to get out there before too long. Now, your career has been celebrated, obviously, and in 2009, you were installed into the Canadian Music Industry Hall of Fame, and then that was followed by the Juno for entrance into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame in 2010. So that must have been quite the experience for you.
Yeah, it was certainly something I didn't expect. I've got some gold and platinum albums, and double platinum from my experience with April Wine. But I certainly didn't expect a Juno Award. And I was actually in Spain when it came, when it was sent down, and my son picked it up. So he just sent me a picture of it. I didn't even know what they looked like. And it was quite nice. I'm looking at it now as I'm talking to you. It's quite pretty. And it is one of those things that you put out on display because there's not many of us that get Junos.
Well, you wear it with pride, right?
I wear it with pride, I certainly do.
Yeah, so over the years, you've put out several solo albums. Now, I'm curious, are they all independent releases?
They were independent releases, but I had professional distributors. I stayed my own record company, but I distributed through other sources.
Okay. Well, I mean, you might as well let somebody else do some of the work, right?
Well, yeah, it helps to do that. But, at that time, I wasn't touring outside of the Maritimes. I played in the Maritimes mostly I got into house concerts about 18 years ago. I loved them. I find them a very good gig for a solo guy or a duo. And at that time I was doing solo because I was getting back into playing. And it takes a while to find your place as a performer. And I was a solo guitar player. And I had developed a kind of a style that was more closely related to Mississippi John Hurt than Jimmy Rogers. But it had a country blues side to it, if you're familiar with Mississippi John Hurt. Very distinctive. And I loved the band, the feel of the band. So I had kind of, without knowing it, I had developed this style that was unique to me. And not too many acoustic players, none that I know of in the Maritimes plays the style that I do. But I gradually got quite a number of venues in the Maritimes that I could go to, once a year or so, and set up little tours. So that's what I was doing. I had retired in 2000 or 2001 from the medical work. Yeah, so I went back playing. And I really enjoyed what I was doing. The crowd seemed to like it. I was moving CDs, merchandise, and it was just a great time as a solo artist. I loved it.
No doubt. I did that for a while too. And it's interesting that you guys all decided to get into original music at an early age too, because I think that's a mistake that a lot of musicians make. You get caught on a path where you're just doing covers, and it's hard to break out of that. I mean, I spent the majority of my full-time musical career as a lead guitar player in other people's bands and singing Cliff Richard songs and so on. And it wasn't really until I decided to stop being a cover guy that I really found the joy in the music. So kudos to you all for going down the right path early with the original stuff. And it's interesting that now you talk about developing a kind of a Delta blues style. And I understand that in recent years, your old partner Myles found that niche as well. And the two of you have been working together. So tell me about that.
My wife and I were down in, I think we were in Costa Rica or Cuba, I can't recall which. And Myles and his partner were over in Dominican about 6 years ago for the winter, right? And he called me from the Dominican and he said, look, I'm considering starting an acoustic act. I want to do an acoustic act. And I know you've been doing it. Are you interested in joining forces? That type of thing. And I said, geez, I would really be interested in that because we had worked together very infrequently since I left Wine. Probably one or two times, that was it. So we started that acoustic. We played. Our first gig was Calgary, I recall. We were both a little nervous, We had learned acoustic versions of his tunes because he's, as you know, he's got quite a few hits you can draw from. And we discovered that there was, how should I put it? There was a place for this in his career and in my career. So we started playing together 6 years ago, and then probably after about 2 years, we added a bass player, Bruce Dixon, who played with Rita, actually, and he had a beautiful high voice. He had that beautiful third harmony that we were lacking. We did a lot of harmony. Always had, as a matter of fact, him and I. And so we added a bass player with beautiful harmony. We became a trio. We were very proud of our harmonies. I just love harmony, and this satisfied something in me that I'd been longing for a long time. So we continue that, and just recently, now, of course, COVID wiped us out, right? Gee, my God. I think we were touring Florida, Texas, and Arizona the spring that COVID appeared on the scene. And we actually heard about something while we were down there. It was this disease that was going around that seemed to be really bad. And that was our last serious gigs. We did a 3-week tour down there. And I think probably when we came home, that was it for a little while. And so we have found, like last year, it started to come back a little. This year, it's really coming back well. But Myles decided he wanted to add a drummer because, as you know, he's retired from touring with the Rejoined for health reasons and also because of the traveling restrictions and confusion and oh my God, the long lines. The whole thing is very difficult traveling as a touring artist now. So he's retired from that, and his main focus now is on his blues album, blues group, on this particular quartet that we put together. And he's also focusing on songwriter events. I think he played with Dan Hill a couple of weeks ago up in Ontario. He's done them down here with quite a few people. So, yeah, he's got a little bit of a different direction in his career, but it's very satisfying to him as a songwriter because he just got inducted into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame here about, a week and a half ago. So this is very satisfying for him.
Yeah, no doubt. Now, it's interesting to me, I think back to the Stampeders, and certain things are kind of analogous with artists. It was around 1980 that I met Ronnie King, who was the original bass player and frontman with the Stampeders, back in 1980, and he had his own version of the band touring. And I asked him about that, and he said, he always thought that the Stampeders should have been heavier than what they were, and yada yada. And they released an album under his leadership that didn't really do very well. And I was pleasantly surprised to find out a number of years later that the three of them had reunited. And I think what it is that you have chemistry, right? You and Myles have that chemistry. And It's obvious, like you ended up in the same resort area or close enough that you just have that chemistry and things come together and coalesce. And it was meant to be, right? So what's next for you guys?
Well, I'm not quite sure what's next, but we've been writing together. Which we released 2 singles. Yeah, Myles released under his name, under his umbrella. We released a song called Some of These Children, which we co-wrote. I had started the song, and it was more related to another event in North America that was a bit disastrous. And when they found the children's grave, all the indigenous children's grave sites, I decided to turn the focus of the song more towards that. Some of these children never grew up. So I was just about to start doing it, and I thought, Myles, his partner is indigenous, and I said, he might be interested in working on this with me. So I called him and I said, look, I'm doing this, rewriting it more towards the indigenous children's graves that they found. Will you be interested in working with me on this? He said, sure. So we rewrote it, and it wasn't a big rewrite, maybe 4 lines, 5 lines that really took it to that place. And then we recorded it and released it to the radio stations, and it seemed to do okay. But, it's a timely thing. That type of song has its time, right? Has its time. And then we recorded a Christmas song called Ring the Bells, which we co-wrote and released for Christmas last year. I'm sure he'll be recording another CD. He just finished one called Long Pants. I would expect that there'll be another CD in the future. It'll probably be the quartet playing on it, but it'll be Myles Goodwyn product.
Okay, so when the 4 of you are playing shows together, is it just billed as Myles Goodwyn, or is there a group name?
Yeah, Myles Goodwyn. Some people look at it as Myles Goodwyn Quartet. Some people call it the Myles Goodwyn Show. Myles Goodwyn featuring whatever. There seems to be a lot of descriptions around on that, but the main thing is that it's Myles' show, right?
So you're playing guitar and singing harmonies in that act?
I do some lead too.
Okay.
I do some lead singing on a few songs. Yeah.
Okay. And do you have any upcoming dates in the not too distant future?
We're starting a tour actually this week. We leave on Wednesday. It's a maritime tour of Cape Breton, PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland for IG. And that will take us to about 10 different venues throughout these provinces. And so that's nice. We've had a couple of gigs that already started last week, and the rehearsals you mentioned when we were talking earlier, those were, we had a couple of weeks of rehearsals to get the show together, and we had 2 gigs last week that tightened the show up, and now we're ready.
Cool. Well, we'll look forward to those dates, and I'm sure they'll be posted on your social media. Listen, Jim, I don't want to take up your whole day. This has been great fun for me. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this with me, and until next time, cheers.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Same to you. Cheers, brother.
Well, there you have it. Jim Henman, like his cousins David and Ritchie, is a true gentleman. What can I say? Now, Jim will be playing with Myles Goodwyn and band Friday, May 26th in St. John's, Newfoundland, Saturday, May 27th in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, and they have dates on Myles' site into October of this year, all on the East Coast. And don't worry, I will put the link to those shows in the show notes here, so just check that out. Now, here, for your listening pleasure, is Jim Henman with Shame, Shame, Boogie. Enjoy.
Okay, we're rolling? Okay. When she was a young girl, sneakers on her feet, she'd head down to Portland Street and she'd show all the boys how to have some fun. But she'd dance all night and show them how it's done. She saw him standing at the bar. She said, he walked up to him. She said, "You're Bobby Marr." And he said, I do not like to dance. Well, she took him by the hand and he never even had a chance. They do the shame, shame boogie. Yeah, they do the shame, shame boogie. They do the shame, shame boogie all night long. They do the shame, shame boogie. Ooh, they do the shame, shame boogie. They do the shame, shame boogie all night long. Well, it wasn't very long, it was her and Bobby Marr. They were driving down the Portland Street in his car. Pretty soon they're talking about a wedding ring soon. But every Friday night they dance like they had wings. Yeah, they do the same, same boogie. They do the same, same boogie. They do the same, same boogie all night long. They do the same, same boogie. They do the same, same boogie. They do the same, same boogie all night long. Well, they found a preacher man who'd do it upright. Bobby thought he found the love of his life, but, you know, she found those weeks so very long. Well, Friday night, Bobby, he was gone, gone, gone. Now she's doing the same old boogie. To do the same, same boogie. She do the same, same boogie all night long. She do the same, same boogie. She do the same, same boogie. She do the same, same boogie all night long. Bobby's gone. Bobby's gone. Now Bobby's gone. Now Bobby's gone. Bobby's gone.
Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including recording, editing, guest acquisition, etc. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a clip from my original composition, The Burn. All rights reserved. And hey, if you like the show, why not help us out? Buy me a coffee, subscribe, hit the like button, and until next time, cheers.